and good morning or good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be learning everyone as part of Fall's Monat Drisha. This class is Genesis to Exodus from Family to Nation. This class is on the construction of the family of Israel, taking place in the concluding chapters of Genesis and the book of Exodus about the formation of the nation. Today we'll be focusing on the start of Exodus, also known as Shemot. We have the pleasure of learning today with Rabbi Silber, the Dean of Drisha. With just one housekeeping note, as people are coming into class, I will send invitations to panelists. If you accept, you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly and more easily. I strongly recommend taking it. And if you accept this invitation, all I ask is to please keep yourself muted when not actively asking a question. Otherwise, please feel welcome to ask questions when Rabbi Silber pauses or in chat during class. I will be monitoring the chat and bring things to Rabbi Silber's attention. Today we will be focusing on chapter 1 of Shemot. If you have your own Tanakh, you are welcome to follow along, but I will also be sharing sources from Sfaria on screen. And with that, I just want to hand things over to...
Okay, very good, thank you. Let's take a look. We started last week, chapter 1. We didn't finish it, and there's some additional points I wanted to make about chapter 1. Chapter 1 in the pasuk number 8 says, "Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadat Yosef." A new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Okay, we spoke a bit last week about what does it mean did not know Joseph. How is that even possible? But we talked about that last time, about knowing or not knowing as a moral failure, not just intellectual, but a moral failure. I just wanted to briefly point out that there are many pharaohs. There's the pharaoh that we first encountered in the Torah in chapter 12, in Bereshit chapter 12. That's when Avram goes down to Egypt. And that's one story of Paro. That's one pharaoh. He deals with that pharaoh. Then we have the story of Joseph, who deals with Pharaoh, a different pharaoh. That's, of course, the Joseph narrative that we're now reading in the synagogue, of course. And Joseph interacts with Paro. Then we have a new pharaoh in the beginning of the book of Exodus. Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadat Yosef. That's the third pharaoh. And later, actually, later on, when God speaks to Moshe, I believe it's chapter 4, God says to Moshe to go back to Egypt to redeem the people. And God to Moshe informs Moshe, even before that, I believe it's. Yes, I'm sorry. Even at the end, even in chapter 2, the end of chapter 2. The king of Egypt died, says in chapter 2, verse 23. It presumably refers to the king that's mentioned in the beginning of the book. You could read it that the former king had died, but it sounds like there's a new king. If there's a new king, a new pharaoh, and there are 4 of them already. So it's either 3 or 4 different pharaohs: the pharaoh of Abraham, the pharaoh of Joseph, and either the 1 or 2 pharaohs of Moshe. And the point I wanted to make about these different pharaohs, 4 different people, is that as far as the Chumash is concerned, in my view, they're all fundamentally the same. There is no real difference between one pharaoh and the next. And I just wanted to make a couple of points about that. The first one, which is a very important point, and when you see it, I think it's fairly obvious, but I'll make the point anyway, and that is that what happens with Abraham and Sarah back in Egypt in chapter 12 of Bereshit is essentially what happens in our book in Shemot in chapter 1. Because we all remember, there's a famine, and Avram goes down to Mitzrayim with Sarah because of the famine, and he says to her, when we get down to Egypt, they're going to see you. You're very beautiful, and they perhaps will take you And if they know I'm your husband, they will kill me. Say therefore you are my sister, that it go well for me, and that I live because of you. And what happens is they go down to Mitzrayim, and yes, they see Sarah, but those that see Sarah are the officers of Paro, Sarai Paro. They praise her to Paro, and she is taken to Pharaoh. So she's taken by force. Yes, Abraham had said that say you're my sister, and she does say that he's my brother. But in any event, the first time we have going down to Mitzrayim, we have going down to Mitzrayim in a time of famine, which is why the brothers went down to Egypt later in the book of Bereshit. We studied that. And we have the story of seeing and taking, and specifically taking the woman and potentially killing the man. Avram says he's just my sister. So he survived. He was concerned about that. So the Ramban, on the spot over there, and when we studied Bereshit, we made this point, cited the Ramban. The Ramban noticed something interesting about it. First of all, the Ramban says what happens to Abraham in Mitzrayim with Sarah is what happens in the beginning of the book of Exodus. That essentially what you have in chapter 1, and we're going to review this again, when Paro speaks to the midwives, and we'll deal with this again, there are midwives, that's in chapter 1, and Paro says in verse number 16, Vayomer, so Paro said in chapter 1, verse 16, when you birth the Hebrews, or return al-Havnayim, and you see them on, I get the birth stool, they translate, in Beinu v'amitenoto. If it's a boy, kill him. V'imbati, if it's a girl, v'choya. If it's a girl, then you can keep her alive. V'choya, keep her alive. And what the Ramban noticed, what the Ramban pointed out, is that Ramban pointed out that actually, why does he say? Why did Paro say to the midwives, "Imbati v'choya," right? And of course they don't follow his instructions, obviously, and Paro gets angry at them. Why did you do why did you disregard me? But you kept all the kids alive. And midwives gives their answer. So the Ramban points out, says, why did Paro say Imbati v'choya? It seems to be an emphasis over here that not just to kill the boys, but to make sure the girls live. So the Ramban points out that actually it's not, in other words, there are two different things that are going on. One is to kill the boys, the other is to kidnap the girls. V'choya, make sure they're alive. And the Ramban says that what Paro was saying in chapter 1 of our book, in Shemot, is what Avram was afraid of in chapter 12 of Bereshit. When he said to Sarah, because he emphasizes, when they see you, you're very beautiful, they will kill me and keep you alive. Yechayu, in the sense of keeping alive. So the Ramban asked the question, what do you mean Yechayu, they will keep you alive? Why mention earlier? They're going to kill me is the point. But Abba was making a different point, which is what's going to happen down there is certainly bad for me. But frankly, I'm not sure it's much better for you, because you're going to be kidnapped by them, you'll be imprisoned by them, and you'll be a kind of slave. That's the point. So the Ramban says that's exactly the point over here in Sefer Shemot, when Paro said to the midwives, kill the boys, but the girls should live. He's not saying, oh, we don't want to kill all of them. He's saying something different. He's saying kill the boys so we can take the girls. That's the point of the Ramban. Now, the point, I wanted to make a different point about the Ramban, why it's very important what the Ramban is saying. The Ramban, among other things, has a very keen literary sense. But the point that's important for us is that what the Ramban is saying is when you read the first chapter of Shemot in light of chapter 12 of Breshit, you come off with a different interpretation. Because if you had only chapter 1 of Exodus, if we only had this chapter, we would say, and Paro said, make sure you kill the boys. The girls I don't care about, they can live. But when you read it in conjunction with chapter 12 of Breshit, they will keep you alive, then you read chapter 1 of Exodus very differently. He's not saying we don't care about the girls. He's saying the opposite. We care very much about them. We want to take them and we want to enslave them and we're going to make them part of Egypt and we'll get rid of the boys, but we're going to make sure the girls are alive. So the Ramban is interpreting a verse in chapter 1 of Exodus in light of the story of chapter 12 of Avram going down to Egypt, which is a very important story. It says a lot about Mitzrayim as represented in the Chumash. It's a place where they will take what they see. They'll see you and they'll take you. That's the story of chapter 12. So that's one paro. That's the paro that takes Sarah. And in that story, we all remember that the way Sarah escapes from Paro, the Torah says, of course, how can you escape from Paro? In fact, some of the Mefarshim say the following about that story of the kidnapping of Sarah. And they make the point that what was Avram's thinking going down to Egypt in the first place? So the Ramban thinks he sinned. The Ramban says he made a terrible mistake. We shouldn't have done it. He puts her in jeopardy and all that, which I think is the best interpretation. But those that want to defend Abraham, and this is true even according to the Ramban, they make the point that it was not Avram's intention that Sarah be taken. He doesn't want it to be taken. But what he says is, say if I'm your brother, so the brother in the book of Breshit negotiates for the sister in marriage. For example, with Rivka and Lavan, when the servant of Abraham comes to find a wife for Isaac, Yitzchak, he negotiates with Rebekah's brother, with Lavan. So the brother often is the one who does the negotiation. I don't know if it's always the brother, but it is the brother in that case. So the idea was, Avram says to Sarah, listen, say I'm your brother, and this way they'll come and they'll want to marry you, they'll negotiate with me, they'll give us all kinds of gifts, so we'll make some money. And then when the famine, we'll stall it out, and then when the famine is over, we will hightail it out of Egypt, catch the last train to the coast, and we'll get out of there with some money on the side. Now that doesn't necessarily present Abraham in the greatest light, but that's the idea of it. But the point they make is that's true with anybody. You can always negotiate. But there's one guy you can't negotiate with, and that's Paro. So once Paro takes her, Avram is sunk. Paro will still give him gifts, but there's no negotiating. There's no negotiating over here. So how does Sarah escape? So the Chumash says, I'm sure we all remember, Vayinaga Hashem et Paro, Nigaim Gedolim v'et Beito. God brings plagues upon Paro and his house, and Paro understands it's because of Sarah, and Paro sends Abraham away with Sarah. So there we have the first instance of plagues, Nigaim, and of course we know of the 10 plagues. The 10th is actually called the Nega, Od Nega Achad. We'll see this later in this book. So the point is that the story of Abraham in Egypt is exactly a foreshadowing of the story of Israel in Egypt, our chapter. And my point is that that's the paro in chapter 12 of Exodus, of Shemot, of Breshit. But the paro of chapter 1 of Shemot doesn't seem to be any different. It's a totally different person. But the behavior is actually identical. Now let's get to Joseph's paro. He seems to be the good paro, the nice paro. Gives Joseph all kinds of promotions. He gives him a special coat and a chariot. He appoints him to be the viceroy of Egypt. It all seems like a wonderful guy. But where the Chumash tells the story, it's a little different. And that is, he's very nice to Joseph because he understands from day one, at least that's the way we studied it, interpreted it. He knows what Joseph's going to do. He knows that Joseph will fulfill his dreams His dreams are cows and land. And Joseph manipulates everything to give Pharaoh all the money, all the cattle, and all the land. He does so by giving Pharaoh a monopoly over the food. All the food of the good years is taken under Pharaoh's control. But then in the last chapter, chapter 50 of the previous chapter, after Yaakov dies, then Joseph has to beg to be able to bury his father. He doesn't beg Pharaoh, because apparently he can't even speak to Pharaoh at that point, but he begs the servants of Pharaoh. And when he begs the parents of servants of Pharaoh, as we recall, of course, he says, please, 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 let me bury my father, v'yashuva, and I will return. That's in chapter 50, the beginning of chapter 50, the previous chapter. And then, just to review what happens, Pharaoh gives him permission, as your father made you swear, fulfill the oath. And the Torah tells us that Joseph went up to bury his father. And all the elders of Egypt accompanied Joseph for the funeral. Yosef, the house of Joseph, Rak tapam b'tzonam uv'karam azvu b'eretz Goshen. Only the little children and the cattle remained in the land of Goshen. They all went up, but they left the little children and the cattle behind. And when you read that verse, they left the little children and the cattle behind, you ask yourself the question, why did the Torah say they left the little children and the cattle behind? Why is that even important? It could easily have said Joseph and the family went up. Okay, the little children, maybe they're too young to travel or whatever it is. You're not going to schlep the cattle with you. So it sounds like it's completely superfluous. And what do we know? When the Torah says something that seems to be superfluous or insignificant, that means it must be very significant. It's not a book that wastes any words. And what is the significance of leaving the children and the cattle behind? When you read it, you're not sure. When you come to the next book, the book of Shemot, our present book, you remember that when Moshe goes to Paro and says, we want to serve God together in the desert for 3 days, a holiday to serve our God, Paro refuses at first, and gradually, over the course of the plagues, he is permitting them to go, but he doesn't want them all to go. At one point, he says, no, take the older people. They can go. What do you need the children for? And then finally, he says at the end, you can take the children also, but leave the cattle behind. And Moshe says, we need everything. We need the men, the women, the children, the cattle, our daughters, our sons. But the point is that Paro, in Shemot, refuses to let the children go initially and then the cattle because he's afraid they're going to run away. He doesn't want them to leave. He wants to make sure they have to stay in the land. Now, the point is that now looking back at chapter 50 of Breshit, now we read that verse, it's quite ominous. You want to bury your father? You can bury your father, but the children and the cattle stay behind. Because Paro doesn't want the good Paro, supposedly. No such thing actually exists. They're all the same, that's my point. But the good Paro says, you can go bury your father as he made you swear. You know, Joseph doesn't even have an audience with Paro. He has to beg the servants. And now in the first chapter of Shemot that we started last week, what was Paro's concern in the beginning of Sefer Shemot? He says, look, these people are so numerous. The new Pharaoh, no Chadash, they're so numerous. They're maybe even more powerful than we are. Maybe they're going to join up with the enemy and fight against us. V'yalam in haaretz. That's our chapter. That's verse number 10, right? But we have to outsmart them, lest they join up with our enemies. V'yalam in haaretz, and rise up from the land. Now, what does rise up from the land mean? Well, certainly one possibility is they will leave. He doesn't want them to leave. I mean, it's sort of contradictory in a sense. On one hand, they are dangerous, but we don't want them to leave. But of course, the point is, they're not that powerful. because they're going to be enslaved shortly and persecuted. But the concern is they will leave. And that concern of perhaps they will leave seems to be exactly the concern of the previous Paro in the previous chapter, the old Paro, the so-called good Paro. And if we assume that in chapter 2, when God says to Moshe in chapter 2, or the Torah says rather, that in those days, at the end of chapter 2, the king of Egypt died, and there's a new Paro, which seems to be the plain meaning, and that new Paro is the one that upon whom all the plagues will be imposed, etc. So we have then 4 pharaohs. But the point of the Chumash is you may have 4 pharaohs. What changes are the circumstances. But the pharaoh never changes. Pharaoh was pharaoh. Circumstance may dictate a kinder policy, a more harsh policy, but only the circumstances. But one pharaoh is the same as the other. So that's what Ramban is picking up, in a sense, who noted that the story in the chapter 12 of Breshit is a foreshadowing and a parallel, actually, to the story of this new pharaoh that we encounter in chapter 1 of Shemot, to the degree that he even interprets the story in Shemot when Paro says to the midwives, but the girls can live, he interprets as not can live, but should live, because he wants to take them, the same way the Pharaoh in Reshit, and that's what Avram was warning Sarah. They will kill me and keep you alive. That's not so good for you necessarily. Maybe it's even worse that they keep you alive. They capture you and keep you alive. Okay, so I want to make that point about Vayakam el Chadash al Mitzrayim Asher lo yodat Yosef. Let me just stop here for a moment. If anybody has any questions or comments about this point, about the 4 pharaohs, who are actually one pharaoh, in terms of what they represent, or anything else I mentioned, please speak up now.
And if you want me to unmute you, I can do that. So you can ask yourself if you're sitting in the attendees section.
If there are no comments, I will continue. That was
right.
part 1. Okay, I want to make another point about a verse we read last week. We read last week, verse number 11, verse number 12. In 11, Pharaoh says they're very dangerous, so he determines to impose upon them Inui and Avdut, 2 of the 3 covenantal terms of Sefer Breshit. Vayasim olav sarebi sim in verse number 11, I guess it is. Vayasim olav sarebi sim Uman anotol b'sivlotam. Vayiven arei miskinot l'Pharaoh et pitom b'yet Ramsey. So last week we commented, and the point of last week is that the building of these cities, arei miskinot, here they translate garrison cities, possible, but some kind of a cities for maybe they're store cities, exactly what they're storing, but they're building cities for Pharaoh. Laman anoto, in order to oppress them, the Inui, besivlotam, with their forced labor, with their harsh labor. And the point that we made last week is that it's not that Pharaoh wants to build cities. Oh, we need to build cities. We need laborers to come and build the cities. So there he's going to force the Jews to build the cities. No, it's not that way. It's the other way around. He wants to oppress them. He wants to do the Inui, because the Inui, he thinks, will limit the births. He's concerned about the high birth rate. Inui is often a sexual term, and here it's used in that sense. But my point was last week, the cities are a result of the Inui. It's not that he wants to build the cities, and then by doing that, there will also be Inui. No, he wants to do Inui, and the method of doing Inui is to build cities. I made that point, I demonstrated it last week from the story that appears in chapter 5. This is with the straw. and he wants to punish the Ivrim, he takes away their straw and he insists they produce the same number of bricks. I would have done something different. I would have said, you're producing 15 bricks an hour, produce 20. He doesn't do that. He's going to get fewer bricks. Because the point is not the cities, the point is the Inui. That was last week. I want to make a different point, a little tiny, little minuscule little point on verse number 11. And that is that these cities, garrison cities or store cities, are called here in the Chumash Arei Miskenot. And I will suggest, the Chumash plays with the language, of course, but I'm wondering whether Arei Miskenot, actually, a Miskan, Miskenot being plural, is not actually a play on a different word that appears at the end of this book, which is the word Mishkan. The book of Exodus has 40 chapters, and it begins with building and it ends with building. In the very first chapter of this book, the Hebrews, the Ivrim, are forced to build Arei Miskenot Leparo. At the end of the book, there are 6, and then another 6 chapters about building the Mishkan. It's called the Mishkan. And it starts with building for Pharaoh. It ends with building for God. And that itself is an invitation to compare and contrast the building of cities for Pharaoh and the building of cities for God. Now, there are several very significant distinctions between these two stories that is sort of framing the book. It begins with building and it ends with building. And there are several distinct, very important differences between them. I'll just point out one right now, just one. And we'll come to some other distinctions later on. But the point, just to build on what I mentioned last week, the building of the cities for Pharaoh is not actually, he's not that he's so interested in the cities. What he is interested in is actually oppressing, or suppressing the Jews. And it's interesting that the Midrashim pick up on this. The Midrashim, for example, in the Haggadah, you have reference to this in the Midrashim. And the point is that later on in this description, you have the term perech. The work in later on is in verse number 14. Just a couple of verses down, talks about the avoda, the labor or the slavery. Chomer levenim avoda basada, ekol avodatam asher avdu bahem befarech. That's verse number 14. What is the meaning of perech is the question. See, you see verse 14? Scroll down there to 14. Right there. Right. What is the meaning of perech? So it's a very good question. Sometimes they translate harsh labor or labor that breaks you, like back-breaking labor. Any number of possible meanings of perech. But I want to mention one medrash about perech. And that is, perech, difficult labor, comments the medrash in this avoda that they did, slavery, labor, that they gave men jobs usually assigned to women, and they gave women jobs assigned to men. They're giving people work that probably either not appropriate for them or they're not very good at. Actually, that's a medrash. But it turns out, it's interesting, that the archaeologists found, I don't know, 50 or 75 years ago, they found certain things, tablets, like must be, or writings, tablets, I don't know, that suggest something very similar to what the Medrash says.
Shana?
The
Home?
oh
God.
The Medrash is, but the point of the Medrash, of course, is that
No, I'm really not.
the point of the Medrash is that it's not about the work, because if you give people work they're not very good at, you're not going to get very much work out of them. You get poor labor out of them. So the point is, the point is that the work that you are doing in building the Arei Mishkanot, we would say is not purposeful labor. It's not you're laboring to produce there's some goal that you have, and you are doing the work in order to get the desired goal. No, he's not. The goal is not interesting to him. It's the work to break you down. One might say it's work without purpose. Because work with purpose, people are happy to work. The people have a problem working hard. There's a purpose to it. It's when the work has no purpose, and that therein is an important contrast between the Mishkan and the Arei Mishkanot. Because the term that's used in the Torah for the Mishkan building at the end of this book, which the Talmud picks up and runs with, is called Melechet Machshevet. The one's purposeful labor. And the one who's assigned to build the Mishkan is Betzalel. And he has, the Torah in describing Betzalel, God has singled him out, filled him with wisdom, Lachshov Machshavot, to think deep thoughts. The point of the Mishkan and the point of the rules of Shabbat, labor on Shabbat, one of the defining quality of the rabbinic understanding of what you can do on Shabbat is not hard labor. It's constructive labor, which in the purposeful labor, and the term that appears in the Talmud in several different contexts are the two words Melechet Machshevet. So there's an important contrast between working for Pharaoh and working for God. The Mishkan has a purpose. Every vessel has a purpose. There's a larger purpose for the Mishkan in general, in order that we understand why we left Egypt, etc. God continues to speak to us. That's Melechet Machshevet. When you're working for Pharaoh, obviously, he couldn't care less, and that's this medrash. He gave the men jobs they really not very good at. They gave the women jobs they're not good at, because the desired result doesn't interest him. He'll take away the straw and say produce as many bricks, and he knows you can't produce the bricks. So he gets fewer bricks out of it, because he doesn't care about the bricks. He cares about breaking people down. So that's another interesting distinction. And the point I wanted to make here, as we look in chapter 1 of Exodus, is that when you look at the whole book, you realize suddenly that the book begins with work, with building, and the book ends with building. 12 chapters of building, and the Chumash invites us to contrast the building for Pharaoh and the building for God. So the contrast I mentioned now is Melechet Machshevet, the Arei Mishkanot, a building for no purpose, because Pharaoh doesn't care about the Arei Mishkanot. The Mishkan is very different. That's one distinction between them. That's a critical distinction. Then there's another critical distinction that we will come to later on. So
Rabbi Silber, the word
yes.
Miskain is in there. Miskain, really, really a drooping.
Right, Miskain in modern Hebrew is that way, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I have to check and see whether the derivation of Miskain.
Right. But
be,
it's certainly to no avail and with remorse, so to speak. Yeah.
No avail, exactly. No, exactly. So it well may be. I was thinking about that. I didn't get a chance to check it out. I'll have to check out the etymology and stuff. But certainly, even if it's a different etymology, but the Mishkan and the Mishkan are clearly related, and the bookends of the whole book. So that's a very important point. Okay, that's just to add what we discussed last week. These 2 points, I think they're 2 very important points. Okay, yes.
I just want to mention something which is not interpretation, but just something that is parallel. During Hungary's alignment with the Nazis, they declared forced labor battalions on all Jewish men, and they took everyone, no matter what their civilian occupation was, and they made them dig trenches and they made them do menial labor. And as the Hungarian army was being depleted and beaten by the Russians, there was a minister and defense minister who said, "Hey, we have doctors here, we have engineers here. Why are we misusing them for this purpose? Let's use them to strengthen our army. And there was such a popular hue and outcry against him that he had to resign, because they just were not interested in the labor. They were interested in the humiliation. I just thought I would mention that.
Well, Hungary has a very very nasty history in terms of the Jews, which a lot of people don't know about, but they were certainly very difficult and very harsh when it came to the Jews. And they didn't happen right away in the beginning of the war, but they were terrible. So yeah, but that's certainly the case. That it wasn't about, it's exactly the point. Even when it's beneficial to you, but their interest is not that. Their interest is in oppressing the other. So that's the fun. So now we have, let's pick up where we left off last week, which was in verse number 13. So in verse number 11 and 12, we have the Inui. That appears twice. Inui, Luman Anoto, and Kasher Yanu Oto, Ken Yebevich and Yifrots. That's the Inui. And then when it comes to the next, we remember from the covenant with Avram, Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. So here we have Inui. And now in verse 13 and 14, we have Avdut. And it's interesting. Let's read 13 and 14. It says, Vayavidu Mitzrayim Epnei Yisrael b'farech. Okay, we talked a little about Parech. I'll come back to Parech a little later. So the Egyptians enslaved Vayavidu. That's Avodah. And then in verse 14, Vayimaru et chayhem ba'avodah kasha. They embittered their lives with difficult avodah. V'chomer uvilvenim v'chol avodah ba'sodeh. With chomer, with mortar and bricks, and all the avodah of the field, and kol avodatam asher avdu behem v'farech. So you read these two verses. First thing you notice is that the root of avodah, ayin bet dawid, appears 5 times, and Inui appeared twice for a total of 7, which is significant. And what frames these two verses is the word perech, or parech. So here we have Avdut and Inui, which you have, those are 2 of the 3 covenantal terms. But God said to Abraham, when Abraham said, through what will we enter into this covenant? No. There'll be strangers in a foreign land. There'll be Avdut and Inui. Here, it's interesting, I pointed this out last week. Here you have Avdut and Inui, but in reverse order. Here you have Inui and then Avdut, and we discussed that last week. Why the Inui here is primary and the Avdut is secondary. I mean, they're both important, obviously. So this is a fulfillment of the covenantal promise. That's what the Torah's emphasis. It's not just persecution here, but it's the fulfillment of, as Abraham asked them, through what shall we enter into this covenant? And God said, it's not going to be so simple. You'll be a stranger, you'll be an Eved, and you'll have Inui. Now, what is curious over here, and I talked about this several times in the past, one cannot avoid it, is that what is missing here in this chapter so far is the word ger. Of course, they are gerim, they are strangers. Of course, that's the case. But in the literary approach, as I understand it, you need the language. So the word ger should have appeared here and could easily have appeared here. It does not appear here, but it will appear a little later. Then we'll have to discuss the order, because the order is different. In the Brit Ben Abitarim, it's ger, Avdut, and Inui. In the first 2 chapters of Shemot, it's Inui, Avdut, and ger. So we'll have to discuss why all 3 elements will be here, but in a different order. Just to come back to Perech for a minute, they discovered at some stele, I think about 70, 80 years ago, a discussion of something called Pirchu, believe it or not. Apparently, Pirchu in the ancient Near East, again, I'm not sure exactly in which part of the ancient Near East, But the idea of pirchu was that if you have, let's say you have slaves, and you have a person working for you who's not a slave, a free person who's a laborer, and you have a slave. The idea, what's forbidden is the slaves do a certain kind of work. It's forbidden to give the free person slave work. That's called perech. And what's very striking about that, I assume the Midrash didn't know about that when the Midrash was written. They might have, but it's very unlikely. But what the Midrash was saying, they gave men the women's work and women's the men's work, and that's the definition of perech, is rather striking because it's parallel, very much parallel to the pirchu, the idea of giving people work that's not appropriate to them. With the Medrash, it's not only not appropriate to them, but they're not very good at it either. And that's the point that I was emphasizing. You're giving them work that you know they can't do well. You don't care about that. You're giving them frustrating work. It's very frustrating to work on something you don't know how to do. You also don't produce good results. But it's very striking that the Midrash actually is exactly parallel to the pirchu of the ancient Near East. That was striking. In any event, this Paro is now imposing upon Paro and the Egyptian people, it sounds like, by Avidu Mitzrayim. So a total of 7 times, twice Inui and 5 times Avodah. And however, it says, it didn't seem to be working because at least the Inui didn't work. Israel was still growing and producing more children, etc. So now we have, in verse number 15, now we have Paro taking another measure. So the king of Egypt spoke to Miyaldota Ivriot. The translation you have in front of you is to the Hebrew midwives. That is certainly possible, but the commentaries are divided how to understand the phrase Miyaldota Ivriot. The translation we have in front of us here is that Ha'ivriot, Miyaldot are midwives, and Ha'ivriot is an adjective. In other words, which midwives? The Hebrew midwives. In other words, according to this, and according to the Medrash, these midwives are actually Jews. It's the Jewish women who are assigned to birth or help birth Jewish babies, assigned to the mothers of these babies. And that's the translation we have in front of us. But the truth of the matter is you can translate it differently and something much more plausibly, that Miyaldot or Ivriot is those that birth the Hebrews, but not necessarily that they themselves are Hebrews. They're midwives. Midwives could be Hebrews, could be Jews, non-Jews, etc. Every culture has many midwives, and therefore Miyaldot or Ivriot could mean Pharaoh spoke to the women who are birthing the Jews, assigned to the Jews. They may be Jewish, they may be Egyptians. Asher Shem or Achat Shifra, V'Shem Hashenit Pua. One was named Shifra and one is named Pua. And the Medrash, of course, understands that Shifra and Pua are not just names, but descriptions of what they do to beautify the child, to calm the child, Shifra and Pua. And presumably, if he's going to try to kill all these children, they represent the midwives, generally speaking. He talks about 2 midwives, but presumably there's a whole network of midwives in the land of Egypt. In any event, the question is, are these midwives Jewish? And some Midrashim connect Shifra and Pua to women that appear in the next chapter, in chapter 2, namely Moses' mother and Moses' sister, whose names are not given in chapter 2. We know the names. One is Miriam and one is Yocheved. So Shifra and Pua in the Medrash are connected to Yocheved and Miriam. It's a Medrash. We have to understand what the Medrash is getting at, and we'll try to understand that. Doesn't mean literally that Yocheved and Miriam, that doesn't mean that for sure, but it's saying something about the the relationship of the two stories. But the reason I emphasize this over here, that are they Hebrew midwives? Are they Jewish midwives? Or are they midwives who birth the Jews? That if they are not Jewish, which some commentaries feel is much more plausible, because it's probably more likely that the Egyptian midwives would be willing to carry out the orders of Paro to kill the boys than would be the Hebrew midwives. So it's more plausible, they think, that these are those that birthed the Hebrews. And Paro speaks to them in the next verse, and Paro says, so we spoke about this. When you birth, when you're delivered, you go to birth them. If it's a boy, kill the boy. If it's a girl, let her live. Or as the Ramban would say, make sure she lives. But in any event, the idea of Paro we understand. Birth is and especially in those days, was very dangerous. Many women died in childbirth. So if something goes wrong, if someone dies in childbirth, if the boy dies, people will think it's just an accident. How do you know? How do you know what the cause of death really is? What do we know? Same thing is true today to some degree, in my view. Someone goes to a hospital, something goes wrong. Well, what happened? Someone dies. Is it natural causes? Is it mistakes that are made? With overworked doctors, overworked interns? Who knows? If they all cover for each other, you'll never find out. But things could happen. Things could happen there. That's the point over here. No one's going to know. It's a dangerous thing. Okay, they didn't make it. Sorry about that. That's the idea. It's not a public statement, kill Jews. But he says privately, listen, and you can make sure that they don't survive the birth. That's what Paro was saying over here. But the point over here I want to make about whether the midwives are Jewish or not is the following point. There are people that have feminist readings of the Bible, and I have many issues with that. I like to try to figure out what the text is actually saying, and I think a lot of these readings roam into territory which is very distant from the meaning of the text. But there are two stories in the Bible that is, I would call them feminist stories. It's about women as women, actually. And this is one of the two. Because the point is, this Pharaoh thinks that he's going to speak to the women and say, listen, women, spare the women, but spare the girls, but kill the boys. And the point of the story, I think, is that in this case, these women, the midwives, they're not Jewish necessarily, but the women have a certain respect for life. And the women can't do this. They refuse to do this because they are miyaldot, because they're helping birth. And they're not going to listen to Pharaoh. And the same is true in the next chapter of Pharaoh's daughter. So Pharaoh's daughter is not going to listen. And in fact, the Pharaoh's daughter is going to adopt Moshe. And Moshe is brought to life, essentially, in the next chapter. He survives due to his mother, who gives birth to him, due to his sister, who watches over him, and due to this Pharaoh's own daughter, who adopts him and cares for him. So here you have a story, I think, in the beginning of the book of Shemot. Here you have a story where the women are actually very central in creating a situation where it will be possible to leave Egypt and to escape the oppression. And this is one of the two stories, I think, that clearly is about women. And for that reason, at the very end of the story, which is when we finally leave Egypt and we cross through the waters, through Yam Suf, that the one who gets the last word in the story is actually Miriam. She gets the last word because, as the Gemara comments, they too are involved in the miracle. And the Rashbam comments on that phrase not just involved in the miracle, but they made it possible. Without them, we never get out, because the boys, the men, are actually incapable of because they're all slaves, but it's the women, Dafka, who are able to and understand the idea of bringing life into the world, and they refuse to listen to Paro. So I do think it's actually interesting, especially if it's not Dafka, the Hebrew midwives, but it's those that birth, it's the women who birth the Hebrews. And they're not going to listen to Pharaoh. They're not going to do this. That's not their way they see their place in the world. And they absolutely refuse to carry out Pharaoh's commands. Then he has to move to a different way to accomplish his goal by just openly saying, kill the boys. Just parenthetically, I don't want to get into it now, but I said there are two stories in the Bible that, in my view, are actually about women qua women. I spoke about this many years ago. I did want to mention the other story, which is the Haftorah for Parashat Beshalach. It's actually the Haftorah for the Exodus from Egypt, which concludes with Miriam singing and leading the women in song. So the Haftorah for Parashat Beshalach is the story of Devorah. And the story of Devorah, actually, who also sings a song. You have Shirat Devorah and Shirat Hayam in Parashat Beshalach. What's very interesting is, and this is the point that I made many years ago, when you look at the story of Devorah, and you look at the story in the beginning of the book of Exodus, which is our story, so each of them involves women, but there's a difference between the two stories. In the story of Devorah, you recall that Devorah is a prophet. Devorah Isha Neviah Eshet Lapidot. She's a prophet and she's a judge. She's the only judge in the book of Judges who is actually a judge. In other words, Shimshon is called a judge. Yiftach is a judge. But we can't imagine Shimshon sitting in a courtroom, sitting on the bench. Your Honor, that's not Shimshon. That's Shimshon, and Yiftach is the same. So they're the so-called Shoftim in the book of Shoftim are presumably chieftains or leaders. It's hard to imagine any of them is actually judging, with one exception. Dvarah Yishan Neviah Eshet Lapidot, Yishavta Yisrael Ba'etahi, V'yoshevet Tachat Tomed Dvarah, V'yavo Eleh B'nei Yisrael LaMishpat. She is the classical judge. She sits, first of all. She has a fixed place under Tomed Dvorah, and it says explicitly that all of Israel came to Devorah for judgment. That's what it says in chapter 4 of the book of Judges. So she's the only real judge. On top of being a judge, she's also a prophet. So an amazing person. The only judge in the book of Judges is a woman, who on top of it is a prophet. And she summons Barak ben Avinoam. Barak is a military man, and she instructs him to go to Har Tavar, gather with you people, and fight against the Canaanites, fight against Yavin Melech Canaan and his general Sisera. And you all remember the story, no doubt, that Barak's afraid to go. And Barak says to Devorah, Im telchi imi elech. If you go with me, Devorah, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Now, the demand that Devorah go with him is problematic on two levels. One is that presumably, and would appear so from the Bible, at least in those days, the women weren't involved in combat at all. The women come afterwards to sing songs, to praise. The women are not in combat. So that's why you go with me. Second of all, she has a place here. She sits under Tomed Dvorah to administer justice and judgment. That's her job. So he wants to pull her away from the job that she can do, being a prophet and being a judge, and bring him along with him in a job she's not going to be involved in. So Devorah says to him, I'll go with you. But let me tell you something. The victory will not be ascribed to you. A woman will bring about redemption. That's what she says to in chapter 4 of Shoftim. The woman will bring about redemption. Now, the woman in the story who brings about redemption, so Barak goes and fights, and we all know the story. At the end of the story, the general of the Canaanite king, his name is Sisera, he runs away, and he comes to the tent of a woman named Yael. And Yael's husband has made a pact or a treaty with the Canaanites. His name is Hever. He has a treaty with the Canaanites, so I guess Sisera thinks he's safe to run into the tent. She invites him into the tent, and she gives him milk to drink, and she covers him with a blanket. And then she takes a tent peg when he's sleeping, and she uses it to kill him. She kills him with a tent peg. Now that's how she's the one. That's the coup de grace, and the victory then is assigned to Yael, as Devorah had said. You're not going to get the glory, Barak. A woman will get the glory, and then we have Shirat Devorah, the song of Deborah in chapter 5, which she praises Yael. Minashim ba'oel tevorach. She is praised more than the women of the tent, or amongst the women in the tent, she is most praiseworthy. And the point that I made many years ago, and I mean many years ago, is that there's a story explicitly about women. She says to Barak explicitly, "You want me to go with you? Schlep me, I'll schlep with you. But let me tell you something, mister. A woman's going to get the credit. When you read it, you don't know which woman she's talking about. It turns out to be Yael, the wife of Hever the Canaanite. And the point that I made was this. The two stories are about women, but they're different. Because the point of the story in Shemot, Shifra and Pua, says the Medrash, Yocheved and Miriam. Now, we all know it's not Yocheved and Miriam, and the Medrash knows it better than we do. But it's making a point that the story of Shifra and Pua in chapter 1, and the story of Moshe's mother and sister, they're not named, that the Medrash calls them Yocheved and Miriam, in chapter 2. That's a redemption is brought about. And they're both parts of the redemption. In chapter 1, they're allowing the boys to live generally, and in chapter 2, the mother and the sister conspire somehow to keep this little newborn alive, putting him by the side of the river. And then Pharaoh's daughter sees this little ark, little basket, and the sister runs down and says, "Shall I call for you a nursing woman from the Hebrews?" And then Pharaoh's daughter says, "Fine," and she nurses the child. We'll talk about that next week. But notice that chapter 1 is about birth and chapter 2 is about nursing. So in chapter 1, redemption is brought about by birthing, allowing the child to be born. And in chapter 2, Moshe is brought back to his mother who actually nurses him. And the nursing is not just nursing, it's of course educating, etc. So the women are doing things that are traditionally women's roles. I mean, they give birth and they nurse. When you get to the story of Devorah, though, what's interesting is that two things. First of all, that the way that Yael kills Sisera is, first of all, she gives him milk and he falls asleep. He asks for water, she gives him milk. She covers him with a blanket, puts him in bed with a blanket, gives him milk. And then she takes the tent, the tent peg to kill him. Where in the book of Breshit that we studied, we remember that women are found in the tent. Where is Sarah? She's in the tent. Isaac brings Rebekah to his mother's tent. Lavan searches the tents of Jacob and the tent of Rachel and the tent of Leah and the tent of Bilhah and Zilpah. So the women are identified with a tent, with an Oel. But here it's using the very tent itself as a murder weapon. The tent in the hands of Yael becomes a murder weapon. And not only that, that's true in chapter 4 of Judges. If you remember chapter 5, the verse says something additional, which that Yael sleeps with him many times. It's called like the sexual innuendo, maybe that tired him out, and that enables her to kill him as well. My point then was, that I made many years ago, was this, that in both stories, the women are bringing redemption. But in our story, they're bringing redemption by doing things traditionally assigned to women. They're playing their normal role. But their normal role in this case is used to bring salvation to the Jews. In the case of Shoftim in the book of Judges, they're doing things that normally are not assigned to women. In fact, they're the opposite. They're using the milk to kill, using the tent to kill, using the sex to kill. And the point over there actually is the following. It's a different point. It's that basically the women can do these things. The women are capable of killing the men. But the point of Shoftim is, it's not so much to praise the women. We do praise the women, but it's really the opposite, which is why do women have to do these things? And the answer is, if the men would do their jobs, the woman wouldn't have to use a tent peg to kill Sisera. Sisera would be killed on the battlefield. If Barak did his job and understood his job, you wouldn't need Yael. If Barak understood his job, he wouldn't say to Devorah, if you come with me, I will go. If you won't come, I won't go. Because she says, listen, mister, I have a job here. That's my job, is to be a judge and a prophet. That's what I do. Your job is to be a warrior. So don't take me away from my work. And guess what? I will take you away from your work. The point of the book of Judges generally, which of course has enormous critique upon Israel. The book of Judges is about a bunch of judges, all of whom are problematic, and that this period in Jewish history is one gigantic failure. And the book ends with a call for a king, because if with no king, you have utter anarchy. So therefore, you have two stories which on the surface are exactly parallel, and they are parallel stories. These are the two feminist stories of the Bible. Maybe there's another one someplace, but these two jump out at you. And when you read the second one, you recognize that the first one is very different, actually. It's about birth in chapter 1 and nursing in chapter 2. They're doing what they normally do in such a way, though, that it brings salvation. So that's the point I would make. The men here can't do anything. The men here don't do anything, but they can't. They're enslaved. So it's up to the women. The men are being persecuted, enslaved, and going to be murdered. So the women have to step up, which they do. But that's not the case in the book of Judges. In the case of Judges, the men don't want to do their job for whatever reason. And Israel collectively doesn't do their job, and their leaders are failures, largely failures. Anyway, that's the point I wanted to make about. Now let me stop here for a moment to take comments or questions, and then we'll continue with the chapter.
All right, I see two people with their hands up.
Yeah,
First,
go ahead.
Mr. Marcus, and then Mr. Hanser, and then we'll open things up.
Go ahead.
Rabbi Silber, is
Yep.
This expression that they should look at the birth's tones, is that something that we should stop over? That it's why doesn't it say they should look at the children? That it to
Well, no,
bring
these-
birth tone.
You will see them on the birth stool, right?
Yeah.
Avnaim is a birthing stool. Return al Avnaim, when you see them about to give birth, it means they're going to be called, the women, the midwives are called in just before the women give birth. That's all it means. You'll see them prepared to give birth, and you'll make a decision, depending on boy or girl, you'll decide what to do with them. But yeah, I don't see more to it than that. Maybe there's something else here. I mean, there's something else in the story here which I haven't gotten to yet, but I'll leave that for another time. Anybody else with a comment here before I move on?
Yes.
Yes.
I looked up in Jastro the word miskina, and it's to make poor, to make contemptible, to reduce. And that really fits exactly
Right.
what you're saying about Are Miskinos.
But that's what Rosie said before.
Yes,
You have in the Hebrew with the word miskain.
yes. But
I
in
think you have
fact,
a
in
similar
order
word
to
I
reduce.
think in Arabic you have a similar word too. But I know in the Hebrew, so the poor miskain is a point of like a nebuch, a poor. So that you have in modern Hebrew, and it is related to miskinot. That's a good point. Yeah. Thanks for looking it up. That makes total sense. Right, exactly. Is there anybody else who wants to add something?
Justin?
Yes, to excuse me, to kind of evince perhaps from modern Hebrew, parich means crumbly.
Yes, it does,
And
right.
it seems that Befarech has like maybe a double or triple entendre, that it was intended to take the human beings down a peg, to produce shoddy work, and also physically to produce these bricks that were completely inadequate, but were the products of oppression.
Right, I did mention before that perech, the translation of crushing labor would be a good translation. Look, you have it in the Gemara already. You have it in Hebrew, not only in modern Hebrew. Perech, something which is crumbles or breaks down. So I think that's certainly true. Crushing labor would be a perfect description. The quality of the bricks I can't speak to, but later on, of course, he takes away the straw from them, so they can't actually make the bricks without foraging for them. We'll get to that later, because that's actually an important point. But the obvious point is he doesn't actually care about the number of bricks, because if he cared about the number of bricks, he would give them straw and say, just make more bricks. That's what I would have done. How many bricks do you make? 15 an hour? Make 20. Work harder. That he wants to work harder. But this way, the work they're doing will not enable them to make even the quota. They fall short of the quota. And then he beats them up. Or he beats the taskmasters who fall short of the quota, but they can't make the quota because you took away the straw. This is what they say. How can we do it? No, he says, you're just lazy. So the point is, but he gets the rest out of them. Yeah, but I think crushing, I think it is the one interpretation of it. I don't think the interpretations are mutually exclusive, by the way. I think you can read it both ways. But what else did you want to say?
Nope, that was it.
That's it. Okay, thank you for that. Okay. All right. So let us just continue now. We have a few minutes still. So let's continue. Okay. So now we have at the end of so it says the following. Let's take this verse, very interesting. So the midwives in verse 17. Vatirena hamiyadot et Elohim, v'lo asu kasher diber alehem melech Mitzrayim, vatchayena et hayeladim. The midwives, we are told, are God-fearing. They're God-fearing, Yirei Elohim, and they refuse to listen to what the king of Egypt says. Rather, they keep the children alive. One might even say they actually make sure they live. But they make them alive, they keep them alive. And the reason that is because they are God-fearing. That's the term that's used for them. And this is cited later at the end of the chapter in verse 21. It says, Vayhi ki yaru hamiyadot et Elohim, vayas lahem batim. God saw that the midwives were God-fearing. Because Pharaoh says, what are you doing? And they give an excuse. Let's leave the excuse out for now. But because they feared God, then God rewarded them by Yas Lahem Batim. I wanted to make two comments about the midwives here. First of all, to point out that the idea that they are God-fearing, Yirei Elohim, that's a term that we encountered back in the book of Bereshit, and a very important term. At the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, where Abraham is tested, passes the test, and God said, or the angel calls down, speaking in God's name, I know now that you are a God-fearing person. To be a God-fearing person in the book of Genesis, because we know that when Abraham went to the land of the Philistines, and so did Isaac. Abraham goes in chapter 20, and Isaac goes in chapter 26, and each one says his wife is his sister. And when they're asked the question, why did you do this? Abraham and Isaac both say, I saw that in this place, the people don't fear God, and they would kill me and take my wife. So in each of those instances, both Abraham gives other excuses also why he said Sarah's his sister, but so in those two instances, it talks about the people not being Yirei Elohim, and then Avram is praised at the Akedah because he is Yirei Elohim. So one of the points when we studied the Akedah, we said many things, but one of the points that I made about the term Yirei Elohim in those stories is that he's talking to the king of the Philistines, Avimelech. A Yirei Elohim in the context, and the story deals with kings actually, is that the kings can tend to make up their own rules whatever suits themselves. Kings that could more than anybody else think they are above God. They're going to make their own rules because they're the kings. And the point of the Torah is that the point is that the ultimate decisor is actually God. The Akedah, whatever we may think about the Akedah and Abraham's compliance at the Akedah, it's obvious that the Chumash thinks it's a good thing. Because now I know you fear God and you didn't withhold your son from me, is what it says. To fear God and you didn't withhold your son means you could have made all kinds of calculations. People have 100 calculations. But since you know that I'm actually speaking to you and you're not hallucinating, and this is my will, to fear God means to follow my dictates as opposed to your own thinking. Yes, at the end of the day, that wasn't my interest in actually slaughtering your son, but your willingness to do it demonstrates your obedience to me. And it's interesting that later in the Chumash, in the book of Dvarim, the king, about whom the Chumash doesn't say very much, but the Chumash is concerned with the king, with excess. And the king is commanded to write a Sefer Torah and to read it. So that's chapter 17 of Dvarim. And the reason that's given, the king must write a Sefer Torah and read it, that the king learned to fear God. So the idea of fearing God means that ultimately God is once we understand what God wants, God dictates the rules and no one else, not even the king. So that's exactly the point over here about the midwives. In this context, they fear God, which means they have a different commander. They have a different one who's telling them what to do, and it's not Pharaoh. Pharaoh may be the king of Egypt, but God is king of kings, and therefore the midwives do not obey Pharaoh because they have a higher authority that they feel they must obey. There's no suggestion these are Jewish women, by the way, but the women that in this story over here, the ones who are birthing the children, have this sense. And because they have this sense, it says, because they fear God, we have the very strange phrase, Vayas lahem batim, God made for them houses. What in the world does that mean? So the Rashi quotes the idea of houses being established, sort of dynasties, because Rashi is working with the idea this is Yocheved and Miriam, which is the Medrash, and therefore Yocheved and Miriam, Rashi says, the houses are the houses of the priesthood and the houses of the king, which are institutions that are passed down from generation to generation through inheritance. The high priest is the son of the previous high priest. The king is typically the son of the previous king. So that's the bayit, kind of a dynasty, a bayit in the sense of Beit David, of dynasty passing down. But I want us to conclude our little session this week with the following observation about chapter 1, which is this. The beginning of chapter 1, the very first verse, actually. These are the names of the children of Jacob. Bnei Yisrael came to Egypt. Eit Yaakov, Ishu Beito Ba'u. Each one came down with his bayit. The bayit over here doesn't mean a physical house, obviously. They didn't come down with the house. They came down with the household. The bayit is a family or a household. So when they came down, in verse number 1, they had two things. They had a household, they had a family, came down with their bayit. And they had something else in verse number 1, which is the first verse of this book. They had a name. They had an identity. Now, the point of the book of Exodus will be that the Jewish people are going to lose both. They're going to lose a sense of a bayit because they're going to become slaves. Slaves can really have a family. And on top of that, and we'll see in the next chapter, they have no names. The next chapter is all about a people that have no identity, no names. And with the midwives, actually, it's interesting that what the Chumash emphasizes with the midwives who are God-fearing is they have two things. First of all, they have names. Because the Torah says the names of the midwives, L'shem La'achad Shifra, V'shem Hasheni Pu'ah, so they have names. And now we're told in verse number 21, and they also have a bayit. And that is actually very interesting for another reason, which is we'll have to discuss next week why is it that they have no names? What happened? Why did we lose our not having a name means you have no identity. Why did we lose our identity? There are multiple reasons for it. But there is something else over here, perhaps. And I'll leave with this thought. And that is that the ones who have a name and they have a house, a bayit, are these midwives, Shifra and Pua. They have names and they have a bayit. And the reason they have them is because we are told, because they feared God. And now my question that I'll leave you with is, what does this say about the Jews, actually? Is there a suggestion over here that the Jews at this point in time, or over a short amount of time, cease to fear God? This is actually a very, very important question, because from other texts outside Exodus, there are all kinds of suggestions that the Jews in Egypt have assimilated into Egypt, have adopted Egyptian values and all that. You don't necessarily get that sense when you read the first few chapters of this book. So we have to keep an eye out for that. Have the Jews in Egypt adopted Egyptian practice? Have they sort of fallen away from God? Because one might suggest that, given the fact that being Yorei Elohim allows you to retain or to have a house and a name, and the fact that the Jews will have neither house nor name, does suggest to us perhaps that those who fear God have house and name, and those that don't, by implication, may lose their house and their name. So this question as to the status of the Jews in Mitzrayim, serves their religious outlook, their connection to God, that's a question we'll have to think about as we read through the chapters. There's certainly other texts outside the book of Exodus that suggest that Israel and Egypt has actually lost their way. But we'll keep an eye out for that as we continue. Next week, we'll start with chapter 2. I just want to say this week, we have a parsha class every Thursday. Different people give it. All kinds of different people give it. This particular week, I myself am giving the class. So just mentioning that. I think I have something interesting to say this week. So everybody's welcome to come every week. But this particular week, it happens to be me.
Is that
thank
Thursday
you all.
o'clock? Is that Thursday at 1 o'clock?
It's either 1 or 12:30. I don't remember.
Okay.
Thursday at 12:30.
12:30. Okay. Happy Chanukah, everybody.
Right. Rabbi Silber, but taking Zilpah and Bilhah, that started early also with the non-Jewish women. I guess there wasn't a lot of choice, but the point is, it's always like that. It's happening throughout. And then, I don't know, mitoch lo lishma ba lishma, I guess.
But if they're not Jewish, then the midwives are simply the midwives. They're birthing the and Bilhah and Zilpah, I have no idea who they are. It doesn't really say actually who they are. It's a good question. All right, folks. Any messages, Michaela? Anybody? That's
Yes. Yes, our Winter's Mon will run from December 25th through 27th on the topic of organ donation. To find out more about who is teaching, including Rabbi Reifman, Jason Weiner, and speakers from Renewal, please check out our website, the link of which I've posted in chat. This is the penultimate session of this class. We will meet once again next week, and then we will be on pause until the start of spring semester. Please keep an eye on our email list for when classes will resume in the early spring. And with that, Chanukah Sameach, and have a good day.